Over the last couple of weeks now, we've been wrestling with this challenge and with this thought of sacred endurance. What does that mean? What does sacred endurance mean to us, especially in the season of Lent? You know, Lent is the 40 days before Easter, set aside really for us to really rediscover, think about what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And I think these past few years with COVID and pandemics and lockdowns and now everything going on in Ukraine, it's just really shown us again how difficult it is to persevere and endure in such uncertain times like these. A couple weeks ago, we looked at Hebrews 10 and really the challenge to keep running, to not give up. Last week, we looked at the whole idea of thinking right in our minds in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, as Paul reminded us that we have the mind of Christ and we have to think right. Today we're going to ask another question as we think about all this today. How does this life affect our ability to live with trust and faith? How do things like stress and pressure and difficulty and discouragement play into all this? Where is God in the ups and downs of life? And what about the whole idea that life really ought to be fair and it ought to be just? I'm really grateful that we're not the first generation to have ever asked this question. Today we're going to be looking at Psalm 73. And Psalm 73 raises a lot of these very same questions. Because even the wisest among us, even the most holy among us, are going to come to points where you ask very difficult questions about life. Now, Psalm 73 was written by a guy named Asaph. Asaph was the chief worship leader of Israel. So, how can a guy whose main job is to lead the great choirs and music in the temple write a psalm like this? You ever felt like Asaph before? Let's look at what he wrote. Psalm 73. You ready, everybody? Word! Okay. Now think about it. Chief worship leader in Israel. The main guy in charge of music, singing, choirs. He's in the temple all the time. He's one of the most holy people in Israel. And yet, this is what he writes. He's talking about the world. He's talking about what he sees and how it's not fair and it's not right. He writes in Psalm 73, they have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They are free from common human burdens. They are not plagued by human ills. Therefore, pride is their necklace. They clothe themselves with violence. Wow. From their callous hearts comes iniquity. Their evil imaginations have no limits. They scoff. They speak with malice. With arrogance, they threaten oppression. Their mouths lay claim to heaven, and their tongues take possession of the earth. Therefore, their people turn to them and drink up waters in abundance. They say, how would God know? Does the Most High know anything? This is what the wicked are like, always free of care. They go on amassing wealth. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and have washed my hands in innocence. Read verse 14 with me, church. All day long I have been afflicted, and every morning brings new punishments. Aren't you glad you came to church today? Man, all day long I've been afflicted, and every morning brings new punishments. What's Asaph saying? He's saying stuff like this. Does God really recognize what's going on down here? Does he even care? Why do the bad guys keep winning? Why should I live with faith if this is the way it's going to be? You know, life rarely turns out the way we thought or planned. It seems that people have always struggled with the chaos of life. Things like fires and earthquakes, war, death, promises unkept, unfairness, a lack of justice, and folks who just simply let us down. Asaph is tempted to believe here that his commitment to God has really been all for nothing. In the first part of Psalm 73, you feel like you are listening to a whiny worship leader. But even as Asaph is complaining, there's something deep going on in his heart. This psalm is a great lesson for us today, church. Because by the time Asaph gets to the end of verse 14, the continual focus on all the problems and all the unfairness of this life has damaged his faith. And you know what? He realizes, I got to change what I'm looking at because I'm focusing on the wrong things. And you know what he did? You're not going to believe it. Look what he does. Verses 16 and 17. When I tried to understand all this, it troubled me deeply till I entered the sanctuary of God. Then I understood their final destiny. When Asaph didn't know what to do, when life got completely and totally overwhelming, this guy goes back to church. And it was there his perspective began to change. It was there that Asaph really began to see things the way they are. And so when you look at verses 21 through 28, you see that Asaph saw really that the present is not permanent. That the present is not permanent. Look at verses 21 through 28. When my heart was grieved and my spirit embittered, I was senseless and ignorant. I was a brute beast before you. Man. Yet I am always with you. That's God speaking. You hold me by my right hand. You guide me with your counsel, and afterwards you take me into glory. What beautiful words here. Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Those who are far from you will perish. You destroy all who are unfaithful to you. But as for me, it is good to be near God. I have made the sovereign Lord my refuge. I will tell of all your deeds. One day, the chief worship leader of Israel gets so overwhelmed with life, and he decides it's time to go back to church. And one day he walks into church to think and to pray. And he began thinking about evil and all the evil people around him, and it struck him, what a slippery slope these folks are all on. And sometimes it's really hard for us. It's really hard for us to focus on the eternal when the temporary is so overwhelming. And what I really want you to feel today is I hope you can feel the tension in Asaph's words here today. It is not easy to focus on eternity and heaven when everything around us seems to be falling apart. One day, every disease is going to be healed. One day, no more sickness. One day, no more pain, no more arthritis, no more cancer, no more death. No more. But not yet. So when you choose to live with this spirit of sacred endurance, you're living with this idea and you're living with the hope that one day all things are going to be made right. But the hardest part about the Christian life is that word, someday. So God's got another word for us today, church. Hold on. Hold on. Because the present is not permanent, even though it feels that way on a lot of days like today. The second thing that really struck me when you think about this whole idea of just living right is Asaph saw that the promises of God are enough. He saw that the promises of God are enough. Think about this guy. Bitterness had engulfed him. In a world where trouble and difficulty surround us, in a world where there's nothing but uncertainty, when loyalty is hard to find, Asaph finally came to a place where he realized there is somebody bigger than me. There is someone that I can trust, someone who will stand with us, someone who will stand for us. And I hope today you can really kind of sense the weight of his words today. Who do I have in heaven but you? It makes a lot more sense than a lot of the things we say today. How many times have we heard, hey, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel? I don't know, but in the last couple of years, too often the light at the end of the tunnel has had a train attached to it coming my way. Things are never as bad as they seem. Really? Things are often worse than they seem. I'm really not a pessimist. I'm just a pastor. But over the years, I have watched way too many people put their trust in things that don't last. And my prayer for us today is that we would be more and more like Asaph, who chose to trust God even when he couldn't see through the darkness or the hurt that was within him. On days like today, when we're dealing with $6 a gallon gasoline, when we don't know what's going on in Ukraine, when the world seems to be falling apart all around us, I wonder, how many promises are there really in the Bible? How many promises are there really? Google told me 8,810. I don't know if that's right. Seems kind of light to me. But who knows? But there are so many more promises there than you'll ever need or ever use in your life. And I was thinking this week, what are some of my favorite go-to promises that I really lean upon, that I need to remember? Here's 5 of my favorites. Romans 8:31. What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Philippians 4:6 and 7. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Isaiah 41:10. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. 2 Thessalonians 3:3. But the Lord is faithful, and he will strengthen you and protect you from the evil one. And Acts 1:8. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the very ends of the earth. The promises of God are enough. The problem is we don't know the promises of God enough. Yeah. And if we only would, church, it would help us so much in these crazy days. Asaph, thirdly, he saw that he needed to renew his commitment. Isn't it amazing that a guy who's in church all the time finally realized, I need the God I'm worshiping? It's one of the biggest lessons. You know, Bill, as you get ready to go up to Big Bear, one of the really difficult things about pastoring and leading is you can get really, really familiar with the things of God, and they don't strike you anymore. And Asaph said in verse 28, it is good to be near God. Asaph made an important confession here. Hey, you know what? You know what's really going on these days? You know what's happening to us? The endless challenges of this life, will destroy your faith if you're not regularly enjoying God's presence. It's true. The endless challenges of this life will destroy your faith if you don't enjoy God's presence on a regular basis. You know what? If there's a distance between you and God, it ain't God's fault today. You can't control what others are doing about God today, but you have a choice to keep and to make when it comes to your own personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And when I read through this whole psalm, I guess the question I have for us today, you going to be like the Asaph of the first 14 verses, or are you going to be like the Asaph of the second half? The words of Trillia Newbill. You know, I told you, I read a book, same title, Sacred Endurance, ripped off her title, thought it would be a good thing for this series. Great words that she said. I love this quote. She said, we struggle and fall short in this life. Temptations that could be resisted defeat us at times. Strength and resolve fade, and our flesh continues to wage war against us for as long as we draw breath. Although at times we feel like quitting, when we struggle and fail, it's critical that we don't. Boy, easy to write, easy to read, hard to live. It's critical that we don't. Here's my entire sermon in a single sentence. Trust in God. Trust in God and never, never give up. That's what Asaph finally understood. You know, for the last few months, I've talked a little bit here and there about going back to school a little bit. I've been in classes with Azusa Pacific University to become a certified developmental life coach. Got a few more steps to do before I get certified. But one of the things that has really struck me in this last kind of season of my life is I want to be a pastor. I want to be an older pastor who's able to help younger pastors find their way forward. And I firmly believe this is God's plan for me in ministry in this season of my life. It's been really hard to do. I have more faith and more respect for guys like Randy who have been online for as long as I've been alive and trying to go to school than anybody, because I don't like it. It's hard. It's difficult. But it's really been rewarding. So while we're in class and while we're learning how to coach better, we were asked to read some books and some articles by a social researcher. Her name was Brene Brown. I don't think I'd ever read a whole lot from her before. But as I read the stuff we were asked to read, man, her words moved me. She spoke about things we don't talk about much in our culture, about things, especially in the church, that we don't talk about. What makes this lady so special? Brene spent 6 years trying to figure out the causes of emotional distress. She spent 6 years trying to figure out why people are depressed, so it could be measured, controlled, and predicted. But instead of finding the answers, at the end of those 6 years, she had an emotional breakdown herself. Not long after her breakdown, she was invited to do a TED Talk in Houston. TED stands for Technology, Entertainment, and Design. It's a huge worldwide nonprofit group that's devoted to spreading ideas in the form of short, powerful talks in like 20 minutes or less. Today they cover a wide variety of topics in more than 100 different languages. So Brene was asked to talk about what happened to her. So several years ago, she told her story in front of 500 people at a TED Talk in Houston. And when she was done, she felt like she had really destroyed whatever was left of a career that she may have had. She told her friends, man, if no one more than maybe 500 or 600 people watch this online, maybe I'll be okay. But if more than that watch this, I'm dead and my career is done. But her talk went viral. Not only did 500 people watch her TED Talk, more than 15 million people have seen it today. Why did so many people say to their friends, you got to watch this lady? Brene spent 6 years trying to analyze the major causes of emotional distress. She ultimately discovered that our difficulty is wrapped up in the fear of becoming disconnected. The fear of saying, like, if you really knew me, if you really knew who I am, my failures, my difficulties, my struggles, if you really knew me, I know you would disconnect from me. She said it's this fear of discovery of who we really are that drives our shame. And according to Brene, shame is the greatest stressor today in American life. And then she revealed with great vulnerability that even though she knew all this, even though she'd studied this for 6 years, she had an emotional breakdown herself. I watched her TED Talk again this week. Man, it was powerful. And she said over and over and over again that connection is what life is really all about. But people's memories are tied to the opposite. Have you ever thought about that? That when you ask people about love, they will tell you about heartbreak. When they speak of belonging, they'll talk about times of being excluded. That when they talk about connecting with others, it's the disconnections that they recall. Why did 15 million people watch a 20-minute TED Talk? One reason: vulnerability. She discovered through all of this that the greatest antidote to shame and disconnection is just the simple ability to show empathy. In these last couple years, all of us are saying the same thing. If you really knew what was going on in my life, you would disconnect from me. And I can't handle that, so I'm just going to have to deal with this all by myself, and I'm going to disconnect from everything around me. And 15 million people watch Brene say, "Me too." And so this lady is standing up in front of 500 people in Houston, and she looks in the camera and she says, "Lean into the discomfort. Lean into the discomfort." Because for connection to happen, we've got to be seen. And that's really hard to do, especially in the church. She called us to be courageous, to tell the story of who we are with our whole heart. She encouraged us to be vulnerable, because it's vulnerability that makes us beautiful. And vulnerability is beautiful because it's the birthplace of things like joy and creativity, belonging, and especially love. If you really love somebody today, and they love you back with their whole heart, you know what's at the basis of it all? Vulnerability. I know you, and you know me, and we didn't disconnect. This week I've been thinking about all that in light of Psalm 73 and Asaph. Here's one thing I know. Worship leaders are not supposed to talk like Asaph did. If Jacob ever started talking like this on a Sunday morning, I'm sure there would be lots of calls for me to fire him. Yeah. One of the things about being Christians is that we're always supposed to be nice. We're always supposed to be measured. These first 14 verses are not nice, and they're not measured. When you read these verses, you know what you feel like? You feel like Asaph is trying to disconnect from God. Because if you really knew me, God, you wouldn't want to be around me. One of the most dangerous things that's happening in our world today is that continual suffering, troubles, problems, difficulties, fear, stress, they are disconnecting us from everything that is holding us together. Hey, why go to God when I can just go to 7-Eleven and get a 6-pack and a big cheesecake and just drown my sorrows in all of it? Yeah. Yeah. But as painful as this life is with God, Asaph reminds us that it's a lot more painful trying to live apart from the God that we meet in the Bible. And that's the tension of it all. In one of those great Peanuts cartoons from years ago, Lucy says to Charlie Brown, "I hate everything. I hate everybody. I hate the whole wide world." Isn't that Asaph at the beginning of Psalm 73? And Charlie says, "Lucy, I thought you had inner peace." And Lucy replies, "I do have inner peace, but I still have outer obnoxiousness." Doesn't God just have a lot of work still to do with all of us? It's interesting. Asaph and Brene Brown discovered the same thing thousands of years apart. Connection is what life is all about. And when Asaph stepped back into the church, not just as a worship leader or a leader, but just as a person, he saw the truth. He looked up and he saw a God who wasn't going to leave. He saw a God who wasn't going to disconnect, regardless of what he had said or what he had done. He saw a God who loved him and would always love him and would never leave him. And Avnaz, I'm telling you today, as we wrestle with this whole idea of sacred endurance in a world that is falling apart, part of the answer is found right here in Psalm 73. You know what it is? It's having the courage to be imperfectly vulnerable. Because there's a whole group of people who are just waiting to look back at you right in the eye and say, me too. Sacred endurance involves not only thinking right, but also living right. Trust in God, and never, never give up. And that kind of a life can only be fueled by an intimate relationship with our Heavenly Father. You can't do that when you only talk to Him once or twice a year. You can't have a close relationship to God when we only see you here at Easter and Christmas. It just doesn't work. It's like being married to somebody and only seeing them 5 or 6 days a year. It's hard to do. It's hard to build deep intimacy. And yet when we choose to trust and live like that, we are able to say with Asaph, whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Psalm 73 is right where we're living today when it comes to how are we going to live in this crazy world that God has placed us in. Are we going to live in the first half of this chapter, or are we going to live in the second? And the sad thing is we got so many Christians that are choosing to live in the first 14 verses. I'm saying to us today, church, we got to choose to live in the second half today. So reflection questions this week. I know we've got some groups that are meeting, but here's what I really want you to think about this week when you think about this passage. Think about the big themes we talked about today: faith, trust, honesty, empathy, waiting, connection, eternity. Which word stands out for me the most and why? And is there another theme that I would add to this list? Secondly, where might God be calling me to step out and have the courage to be imperfectly vulnerable? Where might God be calling me to step out and have the courage to be imperfectly vulnerable? Hey, I want to just pray for us today. I want to pray as we close today for just our friends up in Big Bear. So good to have you guys here with us today. I want to pray for all of the needs that we have. You know, we gather together every Wednesday morning. We used to have one column of prayer needs. Now we got two. Bill is talking about putting together a pamphlet for us in the coming weeks because the needs are just huge. Next Saturday, we say we will see you soon to Marie Reeves again. And you know what? I was counting it up. This is going to be the 99th funeral I've been a part of since I've been here in Apple Valley. 99. Wow. We just continually deal with grief and loss and death and transition. You know, and we need to keep praying for Joel. He took a fall this week and banged up his shoulder a little bit. I was talking to Shirley Lawrence yesterday. She's got 2 hairline fractures in the shoulder that she fell on. I mean, we're just falling apart all around us today. But what I'm really thinking today is about those folks who are just really ready to throw in the towel today. Those folks who are ready to say, I've had enough. I don't want to do this anymore. Those folks who just feel like Asaph. Where are you, God? Does it even matter if I follow you anymore? It's a powerful chapter for us. Do the work this week, church. Don't disconnect, because when you do, you lose so many things.